claims that the power of death affects the living as much as the dead. Hi, this is Barry Phillips with 10-Minute Torah, day number 2, the Torah portion, Chukat. We're talking about ordinances or decrees beyond rational understanding. Let's go a little bit further now in the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, chapter number 19, and let's go down to verse number 11. He who touches the dead of any human being is unclean for 7 days. He is to cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he is clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day, then on the 7th day he is not clean. Anyone who touches the dead of a human being and does not cleanse himself defiles the dwelling place of Yahweh, and that being shall be cut off from Israel. He is unclean, for the water for uncleanness was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still on him. The uncleanness of death remains until it has been dealt with. There is some commentary from the Chabad, Chabad.org, the Chukat commentary, that questions the placement of this text concerning the red heifer and why these ordinances are placed here when, in the writer's estimation, these were decrees that were given the first time that Moshe went up onto the mountain for 40 days and received Torah from Yahweh. Why place it here? Should it not have been placed at some earlier segment? Among the many reasons why, my understanding is we are coming to the conclusion of the wilderness journey. What we're about to get into is the death of Miriam, the death decree of Aaron and of Moshe, and then we eventually will get into the book of Devarim, where there is a repeating of everything prior to going into the land. So where we're at in the storyline right now is toward the end of the 40 years. All of those decades in between the previous Torah portions where the decree that first generation was to die in the wilderness and where we are now, all that's taking place. And it would seem that there's not a lot to be said other than the fact they walked around and around and around in circles in the wilderness until one by one, group after group, this previous first generation died off. Therefore, there is a lingering atmosphere of death on the nation. This second generation that is to now go into the land, before they do so, they need to get this death stuff off of them. You don't want to be carrying the stench of death on you when you go into the land where you're supposed to be living. I don't want to get real deep in the weeds on this. I certainly don't want to come across in any political persuasion of things. I try to leave politics as much as I can out of these 10-minute Torahs. But at the time of this recording, the United States Supreme Court has just last week decreed that Roe v. Wade, the court decision in the early 70s that allowed for federal sanctions of abortions in America, has now been overturned. And we are seeing the spill out, the aftermath, the vehement, raging responses by many who were supportive of that earlier decree, now upset, filling the streets, threatening violence. The elite, the movie stars, the famous, the rich, the powerful heads that talk are all threatening about what they're going to do in response to this. over 60 million unborn children have been lost to us because of this earlier decision. I do not in any way support abortion, the taking of a life from the mother's womb. Typically one says, well, what about the case of incest or rape? Incest, maybe you could argue that a bit. Certainly, if it's a child that's involved. At the same time, the life that is in the womb is not at fault. In the case of rape, there are many, many stories, rewarding stories of a child who was the product of rape, was brought up, not hated and rejected, but the mother realizing you're a part of me too. And that individual turned out to be a positive person in life. There are a lot of horror stories. I get that. What about when the mother's life is in danger? It's possible you could argue that terminating a pregnancy for that, but there again are so many stories where a mother adamantly said no, persevered through a troubled pregnancy, and brought forth a beautiful life. The birth process is still a mystery. It's still an overwhelming thing. But the thing is, life in the womb is precious. Now that we have seen this legal decree done away with, it doesn't fix this nation. Many are celebrating and rejoicing, finally we've defeated this thing. But the stench of death is still on this nation. Now that we have this legal decision, we need to move into the areas of, the children that are born that the mother doesn't want, wasn't ready for the pregnancy, not prepared for this. Here they are. What about adoption? Can we make adoption easier, more opportunistic for those who would desire to adopt? Are we willing to train the young mothers who are not prepared to become prepared? That's a possibility. That's a strong possibility. I know for a fact that that can be done. There are ways to go about this positively. It's not enough to get rid of the sentence of death. We must now process the acceptance of life. That's what the waters that are derived from the process of the slain red heifer, its fats being rendered down with ashes in waters to produce, with that fat, ashes, and water produces soap. There's a cleansing water. Cedar oil that is derived out of this is a very fragrant thing, but it's an irritant to the skin that will cause you to scrub. Hyssop oil would have been derived out of this. It's also fragrant, but it's also an astringent. It's an antiviral oil, an antiseptic, a disinfectant. Cedar is a fungicide. It's also antibacterial. So there is a very practical process of mixing these ingredients together to come up with waters for cleansing. And that's not all there is to it, but that's the practical side. There is the spiritual side, and we'll look more at that tomorrow. But let's come to the practicality of this. Abortion is a legally sanctioned event from the federal government. It's over, at least at present. It's now up to the states, and they'll make their varying decisions. But now that the practical part of death has been dealt with, we need to look and ask the Father, how do we practically engage the life of these children who are no longer aborted, but now being birthed? Now what do we do? We need wisdom. We need righteous answers. Pray with me for that. And we'll talk more on the spiritual matter tomorrow. Until then, shalom.